delighted to be joined by STS-1 astronaut and veteran of the of NASA, Bob Crippen. It's very nice to meet you today, Bob.
It's good to be here, Matthew.
Yeah. So Bob flew aboard the first space shuttle mission and was an additional astronaut and commanded 3 additional missions as commander on STS-7, STS-41G and 41C. What drew your interest to the Air Force and becoming part of the space program?
Well, when I grew up, there wasn't any such thing as an astronaut. I grew up wanting to fly, and small correction, I decided to join the Navy to fly as opposed to the Air Force. I did spend some time training with the Air Force. I actually went through the Air Force Test Pilot School, but I was a naval aviator when I did that. And actually, when I was going through, I'll go back a little bit. When I was a sophomore in college, that was the year that the Russians put up Sputnik. And I had done enough reading on rockets and such that I knew that if we were able to put a satellite up there, that pretty soon they would be putting people. So that is where my interest sparked for thinking about going in space. And then when they selected the first Mercury 7 astronauts for NASA, I noticed that 4 of them were naval aviators, and they were all test pilots. So I figured, well, flying higher and faster is better, and maybe I could do that. So I would try to get into the Navy and become a test pilot, and that eventually worked out for me. I was attending the Air Force Test Pilot School out at Edwards Air Force Base when both NASA and the military Department of Defense asked for applications to be an astronaut, and naturally I put up my hand and tossed my name into the rack, and there came a point in the selection process that I had to choose one or the other, and I elected to go with the military.
In '69, it was the first Apollo landing on the moon. So being there at NASA, what was the experience of joining for the first time and being among the likes of the first man to walk on the moon, Neil Armstrong, and being alongside the commander of who you would later go on board the first space shuttle with, John Young? What was that like to be among those elite astronauts who were about to walk on the moon?
Well, I was a new guy and somewhat awestruck by all of these people. I was put to work initially preparing for the Skylab mission, which is the first space station that we did. So I wasn't working directly on Apollo. I was there while that was going on, but I was working trying to get the Skylab vehicle ready to fly. And I still worked with quite a few people. Walt Cunningham was sort of the head of the office at that time, and he had flown on Apollo 7. And then shortly thereafter, Pete Conrad, who went to the moon on Apollo 12, came in, and he became my boss. So I got to know Pete very well. But again, I was a new guy and just trying to find my way around.
In 1972, the program would finish, but prior to that, on Apollo 16, I know John, who you would fly aboard the first space shuttle with, was actually on the moon when the bill was passed for the space shuttle to be built. Where were you, and what was your reaction to hearing that the space shuttle was going to be passed through and that the space shuttle wasn't too far off in the future?
Well, again, I was working pretty much on Skylab, but Deke Slayton, who was sort of head of all of the astronauts, when I joined the program, he said, "Look, guys, I don't have anything for you to fly." He said, "They're talking about this thing called a space shuttle. It's not even an approved program right now, but maybe you'll get to fly on that." And he said that's probably not going to happen until around 1980. So when they approved the program, I said, "Well, you know, it's a real program now, and perhaps I will get to fly on it." So when I finished up the work on Skylab, and we flew the 3 missions in Skylab, I transferred over and started working on the development of the space shuttle.
During that development stage, how would that change since Skylab? Were you working with more advanced technology, or were you still working with the same type of tech that was still being used? And how was it getting more developed? Because I know you would still use bits from the Apollo era and from the Skylab era. So, because I know towards the end of the program in 2011, it was using nearly 30-year-old technology. So how are you adapting to the changing of kind of the focus from Skylab to the shuttle?
Well, the space shuttle was an entirely different kind of vehicle. I had focused a lot of my development work on the computers. I like working on computers. And so I had worked extensively on the computer they were going to use in the Skylab program. It was a pretty small computer, and it was an IBM 4Pi, if I remember right. But the Apollo program had a smaller computer even than that. But with the space shuttle, we were going to use a larger computer. It was going to be very involved with the vehicle. It would be the way we would monitor all the systems on board, and would actually be part of the flight control system that handled the vehicle. So that's where I started my development work. But we were going to build a winged vehicle that we could bring in and land on a runway, as opposed to parachuting in the ocean. So entirely different concept than the things that we'd worked prior to that.
How did it come about, the proposal of you getting on the first space shuttle? So how was the career change kind of, because I know you'll be working among the astronauts, so it wasn't too much of a change, but how did the proposal come to you for flying aboard the first space shuttle?
Well, that was a surprise to me, but we'd been developing the shuttle, and we'd had some technical problems. We were having, because it was a pretty advanced vehicle for that time, the main engines that we had were tending to blow up, which was not a good thing. And we were working on these new thermal protection system we referred to as tiles. But again, I was focused primarily on the computers. And as we started to get closer to potentially flying, we had already done the what we call the approach and landing test out at Edwards Air Force Base, which some friends of mine flew on. But one day they were bringing the Enterprise, which is the vehicle we used to do the approach and landing test, from California, and they were taking it to Huntsville, Alabama for some tests. And they brought it through Houston there at Ellington Air Force Base. And my boss, George Abbey, called me up one day and he says, "Cripp, let's go over and see the Enterprise." So I got my old pickup, and he and I drove out to Ellington, and we were walking around on the ramp where the Enterprise was mounted on the back of 747. And George, in his nature, he kind of looked at me and said, "Cripp, how'd you like to fly the first one?" And I was ready to turn somersaults.
I know you would meet the Vice President, George H.W. Bush, during the process. So from actually working in the more program lab to go into being among the two men who would fly the space, how did your life change during that period of when you were selected to actually flying aboard the shuttle? How would that change all of a sudden for you?
Well, I'm not even sure how to put that into words, Matthew. I was concentrating on learning the vehicle, getting the vehicle ready to fly, and then when we flew it, John and I were both very proud of the way the vehicle performed, and it was kind of natural during those days that following a flight, there would be put you on what we would call the rubber chicken circuit, but you went out, and it was like our 15 minutes of fame. But we did meet with not only Vice President Bush, but President Reagan. President Reagan had been shot just 2 weeks before we lifted off, but we did have a chance to meet him after the flight, and several times, in fact. But you just kind of deal with that part of it. It's not part of the program as far as we're concerned, but it's important that we keep support for the program So you do some of those rubber chicken circuits kind of things.
You would launch the fleet. So what was it like sitting on the launch pad for the STS-1 launch? So this was, other than the attitudinal landing test, had never been to orbit.
Well, as you said, we had never flown people on a rocket that had not been tested unmanned previously. So this was going to be different. But John and I had both lobbied that that was a smart thing to do, because we thought the chances of success were better if we were on board, so that we could handle any problems that came up. And we had done practice countdowns numerous times. So climbing in the vehicle, we'd spent a lot of time in the vehicle. So it really wasn't all that exciting. And as I said, I thought we would probably scrub quite a few times, and we did scrub that initial time on April the 10th. And some smart people figured out what the computer problem was that we were looking at, and it was one of those things that we should have figured out. Is, you know, if it's a problem, cycle power, and it's so if you turn the power off and turn it back on, it would have worked right. But when we went out the second time, I thought, well, it's a good chance that we're going to scrub again. And it was only when the countdown got inside of about a minute that I turned to John and I said, I think we might really do it. And it was at that point my heart rate went up to about 130. John stayed down at a nice cool 90 or something like that. But I was excited. I'd worked for many years. I was when I was selected for that military program, I was 28 years old, and I was 43 at this point on STS-1. So I'd worked for a long time to reach this point, and we were finally going to go do it. And so when it lifted off, it was an exciting moment.
What did you suffer any technical kind of issues? Because I know John talked about on the return that with the kind of carbon panels, it was like the shuttle had been hit with a baseball bat. So kind of what was the kind of experience of returning, and was it a good flight, and what did you learn from it?
Well, you know, that's the reason you do test flights, is to find out new things and to correct them. We did find a few problems, but overall it was a pretty good flight. It turned out that when we lifted off, the shock wave from the solid rockets reverberating off of the launch pad had actually cracked a strut up in the forward part of the vehicle, but was holding one of our fuel tanks. We didn't know that at the time. That was only found out after we came back and the vehicle was inspected. So that needed to be corrected. And on the first stage, when you're on with the solid rockets, it's what we call open loop guidance. It's not a closed loop kind of a thing. So it's just trying to fly a trajectory. And we went above our planned trajectory by quite a bit. Both John and I could see that on our displays, but it's better to be higher than lower. So that really didn't turn out to be a big issue, but it was something about the aerodynamics that we needed to correct. I got pretty excited when we had the solid rockets burn out and ejected off, because we'd been pulling about 3 Gs, and it was very noisy and shaky with the solid rockets. And then it got very quiet. And the G level dropped off to about a half. And I thought for a moment maybe the engines had quit, but they hadn't. They were still burning. But most of the ascent, except for that first part, went pretty nominal. It takes 8.5 minutes from being on the pad to going 17,500 miles an hour. So we went on and got the main engine cut off. And I got to experience being weightless for the first time, and also to get a view of this beautiful Earth we live on out the window.
I never talked about John Young as commander of the STS-1 and the Apollo 16 astronaut who would walk on the moon. What was John like as a character and a person to be around? Because I can imagine he seemed, as you said, he would have a steady heart rate of 90 while yours was at 180. What was he like as a person to be around and to have as a crewmate?
Well, it was great flying with John. You know, prior to being assigned to be on the crew for STS-1, I mean, John was the big boss, and I really didn't work with him that closely. So I got to learn a lot about John during the 3 years that we trained for that flight. probably one of the funniest men I know. Has a very dry sense of humor, but I often quote, wish I'd kept a notebook of all of his one-liners that I could have published and made lots of money. But I learned John was an excellent engineer, and I learned if he was worried about something, I ought to be worried about it as well. But we worked together very closely in that period of time. And actually, after the first flight, I became his deputy of the. He was the chief of the astronaut office, and I was his deputy. It was he became not only a boss and a workmate, but he was a good friend as well. As we're approaching the 40th anniversary of that first flight, and I'm just sad that John's not here to celebrate it with me.